and welcome to Sounding Board, a community access television production of Seroptimus International of Novato. My guest today is Mike Pelfini, and I'll have him introduce himself in a moment. My name is Madeline Peters, and I'll serve as the moderator for today's program, which is going to be on whole brain thinking. But first, before we get into our topic, a little bit about Seroptimus, sort of our commercial. Our mission, Seroptimus International, is improving the lives of women and girls through programs leading to social and economic empowerment. So, Mike, thanks for being here today. And I'm familiar with your background, but I'm going to let you provide a much bigger context. I know that you are involved now in executive coaching, organizational training and development using a model called whole brain thinking, but I'll have you elaborate on that. But first, Mike Pelfini, a little bit about your background.
Very good, and thank you, Madeline, for having me be a part of the Sounding Board program. Yes, I'm a former special education teacher. That was the initial part of my career, and most of my career has been spent in as a CEO or in senior executive positions within the social sector, kind of the nonprofit area. And recently I have started a consulting practice and coaching business, helping senior executives and individuals and teams to be as effective as they can be. And what I came across as a CEO was a model for building effective teams, leveraging the diversity within the teams to help them to be more productive, helping enhance communication, and that model was something that I brought on into my company and found it to be very effective, and it's something that I'm using now in my private practice.
Well, I think just the whole topic and the coaching and having teams work more efficiently, I'm sure all of us have been victims of endless meetings and group processes that just don't seem to work.
Right.
It just seems as though we're all involved in more of these organizational meetings that don't seem to have any results other than making people feel exhausted and dreading that kind of interaction.
Exactly. Well, when you think of teams are typically built by function. So, for example, in my experience, before I became familiar with this model, we would have a team, for example, that was charged with developing a certain kind of service or program for people that we were going to be seeking to serve, and we'd put the program people on that. We'd put the people who, had the degrees in whatever specific area that was, that we wanted to focus on. And that was good for the content that we needed to have developed. But in terms of how to build a program that could be launched in a fiscally viable way, and one that met all of the community's needs, we were limited because we didn't necessarily have all kinds of thinking styles represented on the team that developed that program.
I think probably what strikes me, just the little bit that my experience and the little bit that I know about sort of like organizational development and training is that, you're lucky if in an organization you have the leadership that really understands how to build communication and really kind of organize to do the business of the organization in an effective way.
Right.
It's something we think people may have, or they're in leadership positions, or they're part of a team because they have a certain skill set. They may or may not have that.
Right.
I think what you're suggesting is something that is a little bit more developed and almost an instructional practice or something like that. Is that?
Yes, and it's from the standpoint of being a model that has validity and has it's got scientific research. It's research backed. It's based on brain research from the 70s and 80s, and it's got. Here's what did it for me as a CEO, looking for a way to address some challenges that we were experiencing. it's simple to understand. And it involves, each individual taking an online survey, and I can describe a little bit more specifically what the model involves, but the point is it was simple, and it was designed for business applications. It wasn't, in other words, the information that the survey yields is not just kind of interesting information. It's information that can then be leveraged to real life situations that you find in the business setting. And I'll talk a little bit later about two specific ways that we used the information that we got with our team.
Well, one of the things that you bring up, because you talk about the documentation and the research behind this particular model, I guess, again, back to my own experience and just wanting to be part of a group or in conversation where we're going to do something, we're actually going to have a plan that's actually going to work. And what you're suggesting here is there's a process that's involved that helps the key players understand what they have to think about.
Right.
Am I right on that?
Correct. It is.
And you talked about brain research. Fortunately, we do have a lot more research on how the brain works, and I've seen it applied in lots of different situations. But the conversation is the first one for me when you're talking about some sort of organizational application, which I find very intriguing. As I said, sitting in on a number of meetings and things like that.
Right.
You wonder what's going to happen.
Right, right.
So can you elaborate on, tell more stories? Can you elaborate on that?
Sure.
Can you talk about this a little bit? I know you have this very fascinating chart here.
And I'll get to that in a moment. I'll start with a very, very brief story. Imagine, for example, that you're out hiking with some friends, and you find yourselves at the base of a mountain. One of your friends says, "Let's climb the mountain." And immediately, another friend begins to calculate, based on the topographical map that he has, he begins to calculate how long it's going to take to go up and back based on the percent elevation grade of that he sees on the topographical map. And then another friend begins to think about, well, okay, if it's going to take that long up and back, then I'll provide the snacks that we need, and I'm sure we're going to need to hydrate ourselves. I'll bring the water and make sure that we have a compass just in case, and I'll make sure that we have a first aid kit. And then while she's thinking about that, another person in the group is thinking about, oh my gosh, we're going to be gone that long, and I don't know if we're going to have cell phone coverage. And I know that there's a member in our group here that's waiting to hear about a very sick relative. And what if we get up there and she doesn't have cell phone coverage, and she's not going to hear? She's going to feel terrible. And these other couple of people, I mean, look at that elevation grade. They're not in good shape. They're going to feel very embarrassed, and so she's thinking about how the people are going to be feeling. Meantime, the person who had the idea to climb the mountain is halfway up the mountain by now.
Let's just do it, right? So not everyone starts off with the same assumption as the person who
Correct.
proposed.
And what I just
idea.
described, really, in a very simple way, are the four really main ways that people tend to think.
Okay.
And what the brain research of the late 70s and early 80s shows is that people have their own ways that they tend to take in and to process information. And what whole brain thinking involves is when you know the ways that you prefer to take in and process information and the people around you, how they prefer to do it, and then when you are able to access other ways of thinking that might not be your preferred way of thinking, but the situation that you find yourself in calls for that kind of thinking that might not be your preferred way, and you're able to access that, all of that together is whole brain thinking.
So what, just my own sort of understanding of your concept is like it's so funny, the example you used, I knew exactly what role I would play in that hiking team. It would be making sure that we had the people were hydrated and we had the snacks,
Yes.
And
You're the safekeeper.
I'm the safekeeper, right?
Yes.
It's just, I went right to that. But it also made me think that's all I would think about.
Mm-hmm.
But what you're suggesting here is that maybe if a group can understand the different kinds of thinking that's involved for any kind of project, I would have my preferred way, but I would also be able to participate or access these other areas of thinking that I would not necessarily be automatic for me.
Correct.
But you're saying that this is something now that that's based on research, but can be applied in a variety of situations.
Yes,
and
this whole...
people can be trained. They can learn, they can practice this different kind of thinking.
There are tools available that help you to bolster the areas, the kinds of thinking that are not your preferred ways of thinking. Again, based on the situation. There is no right or wrong way of thinking. The fact that you would be focusing on the safekeeping and the hydration and all of that doesn't mean that the person who's halfway up the mountain thinks in a better way and you think in a less, or that you think better than that person. All it means is that the situation calls for, in that particular case, all four kinds of thinking.
True.
You know, there are no so the expression is there's no right or wrong way of thinking. There are only situational consequences to a certain way of thinking. And the key is, and the good news about brain research is that the brain is able to, we are, short of having a brain injury, we are able to think in all the primary ways that we need to. Some, we have our preferred profile, but we're able to go to these other ways of thinking. And yes, there are tools and there are ways to enhance those ways, those styles of thinking that maybe are less preferred, and there are ways to leverage our preferred ways of thinking. And that's all that, that was the model, that was the program that I brought into my work setting.
You must have been very happy to find some way, because I know you've been an executive in a variety of situations for a number of years, working, to advance the organization.
Right.
So this must have been reassuring for you.
Well, what it felt like there was a door opened, and that we were able to cross a threshold into ways to be more effective more quickly. This was like an almost overnight aha that allowed us to build teams much more efficiently that could then be more productive. It allowed us to communicate with each other much more efficiently, again, almost overnight. So it was simple, it was quick, and we knew that we had a methodology to the extent that we worked the model. We had a methodology that we could apply to any circumstance that we would find ourselves in.
So this would be appropriate then if you're talking about just a small organization or a small group, a service entity, a business, a school, just about any different...
And just individuals. I mean, to be able to understand your own thinking preferences and again, being able to understand yours and get a sense of the people that you interact with, what theirs is, and then being able to move your own thinking into other areas that aren't your preferred ways. That's whole brain thinking.
Well, one of the things when you and I had an initial conversation about this, I can remember the setting, we were talking and you were providing me with an initial sort of background information, and I remember listening to you and thinking about a setting I had been in. Mm-hmm. Finally, was able, just by our very cursory conversation, able to see what role I played in that, but also what things perhaps I wasn't thinking about. Mm-hmm. So I found that intriguing and had to learn more. So
yes.
And the more conversations we have, and certainly having you here to elaborate on it, the more I'm seeing, well, this is a way of thinking that really is important, as you said, as a tool to get people to work together and be much more functional and efficient and communicate more effectively, which can apply to a variety of situations. I did not understand until you mentioned today it's individuals as well as
teams.
As teams
yes.
And groups, I don't know if there's an optimum number, but it piqued my interest.
Well, the optimum number I think is I know that there are groups that are very large, 100, 200, 300 people who've been trained in this model in one sitting, as well as individuals. Usually, the way I work is usually with teams, individuals, and if mm-hmm. I'm going to be working with teams of 6 to 8 individuals. Mm-hmm. I'm feeling called to give you share some history on the model and the basics of it and how it works,
I would love that.
and then give you some specific examples.
Sure.
Okay.
I always like when things are translated into applications,
Yes.
the concrete applications.
Yes, me too. So this was begun, again, as I've referenced, based on the research the brain research that was being conducted in the late 70s and early 80s, left brain, right brain, triune brain theory, all of which was kind of analyzed and brought to bear for business applications by an individual who named Ned Herman, who was at the time the head of management development at General Electric. And he experienced all of those different kinds of thinking styles in the managers that would come through the curriculum to take the programs and the development curriculum that he was charged with putting together for GE execs. And he decided that there's got to be a way to simplify this. And so what he came up with was really, he took all of that research and he came up with a metaphor that's represented here in this model graphically for the four primary ways that people think. And typically there's, so you have here on the left side, you have the blue and the green quadrants represented. On the right side, the red and the yellow quadrants. Thank you. So the upper left having to do with logical, analytical, fact-based, quantitative, data-interested kinds of thinking. That was, in my example, was the first person who had the topo map and was calculating how long it would take. Loves math, loves numbers. The lower left, or B quadrant, is the safekeeping, as I mentioned. That's the person who's organized, plans, predicts, is detailed. It's a person who gets things done, process-oriented. That's the kind of thinking that has to do with kind of safekeeping. The lower right, or C quadrant, is the interpersonal quadrant. It's thinking that has to do with, it has to do with feelings and the emotional side of the human experience. It's very kinesthetic. People who prefer this kind of thinking touch a lot, This is the person who was concerned, who clued right in on, oh my God, we're going to be gone that long, and Sally's got her grandmother in the hospital, and she's not going to be able to hear from her. So that's this person. And then the person who had the idea to climb the mountain in the first place is represented by the upper right, or D quadrant thinking. So all four, typically we have two modes that we prefer to think in. The key is we're able to use all four modes. And it's just the situation. And what real leaders are able to do is to move through each kinds of thinking depending on what the situation calls for. And that's one of the things as a CEO, when I was familiarized with this model, I finally had a tool that allowed me to, in a very concrete way, come into new situations and say, okay, it's time for me to lead. What does the situation call for? And I was able to come into these, use this model.
Could I have you get into the application of it?
Sure.
We have about 10 minutes
Okay.
left for our program, and I think you've done an excellent job of explaining sort of the conceptual model.
Okay.
So how does this work? What are your real-life examples?
Sure. I can tell you that there's some of the corporations out there that use this model actively today. Cirque du Soleil, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Department of Forestry, Starbucks, Johnson & Johnson, the Wharton School of Business, and on and on. It's a very effective model. I won't talk about it. I could spend time talking about how they all use it. I'll tell you about my experience. One of the first ahas I had so we take this survey, and what you get is a profile of each person. Has a profile based on answers to the questions, the online survey, the profile has a score in each quadrant and shows you what your quadrants, where you prefer to think in each quadrant. The higher the score, the greater the preference. Doesn't have to mean less competency, the lower score. It just means less preference for thinking in that area.
Right. It's what you perceive, what the person perceives as one's strengths.
Exactly. Probably 70% of a person's thinking preference profile comes from environmental factors, how you were raised. Maybe 30% of it is how you're hardwired. So the first application I had was, oh yeah, okay. Up until the time I saw my profile, which happens to be very strong in the upper right and lower right, secondarily here and much less here. I had a hard time communicating with my CFO at the time. I'd come into his office, I'd be asking him for a report, and because I'm so concerned about the big picture, I would give him every reason why I wanted the report before I gave him the report. And inevitably, he would, within a minute, his eyes would glaze over, and I could tell he was not listening to me any longer. And I'd shake my head, going back to my office, and find myself scratching my head, wondering what language I was speaking. Turns out he's very strong in, prefers thinking in the logical, analytical. He's very concerned with what. I'm concerned with why. So now that I know this, I'm going into his office. The next time I went into his office, I'd say, okay, Johnny, I need the last 2 months' income and expense statement for the after-school program. He knew exactly what I wanted. He was able to produce that.
He was happy.
He was happy. And then I said, and Johnny, I need 15 minutes of your time this afternoon because you need to know why that information is important. And
the context, the larger, the bigger picture.
He still, as the CFO, needed to know why that information was important, but I recognized his need to be able to prepare for that kind of conversation based on his thinking and communication style preference. So that was just a quick aha. Another example was that, we did fundraising in this company that I was leading, and inevitably our fundraising activities, our events, were very disorganized affairs. And they rarely met budget.
Oh my.
Yeah, and so, the planning was always, there was a lot of last minute Keystone Cop type of activity, frenetic activity, getting ready for the events, and then the day of the event or night of the event there was always something that went awry. And so, as it turns out, we had, as I referenced earlier in our discussion, a fundraising team that was comprised of fundraising professionals who happened to be very, at least my team was, very much oriented to interpersonal relationships. Not so much on the planning.
Oh, really?
So what we did was or of really putting together budgets that were realistic. So what we did was we reconstituted our fundraising team.
Okay.
And we made sure that we had people who certainly had the interpersonal type of thinking, but also had planners, and then we had people who were able to put together budgets that made sense.
So that you could actually put together an event team that would represent all of the thinking that's needed in order to kind of shift these events from being problematic to being productive. We have about 5 minutes left. And
okay.
I feel as though we're just kind of getting started. But is there anything that you can elaborate on, or that you want to make sure that you attend to? Because the application of this model is very important. It's like I can see it now in the example that you gave.
One of the things, I'll just share is that, it's important to remember, and a key point is that, each of us is walking around with a certain profile, and this isn't, you don't have to believe in this. This isn't like, the heart pumps blood through the body. That's science. People have preferred ways of thinking. That's scientifically shown. So the key is to remember that one is able to think in all 4 ways. It takes a recognition of the situation that you find yourself in, and then a willingness and ability to move into a less preferred mode of thinking to address that situation. And so, none of us walks around with a preferred way of thinking and of communicating if we want to be effective in our work or in our home life without adapting and being flexible.
I see.
And so part of my work in the coaching and training that I do is to help individuals and teams to be more flexible and to be able to understand the situations that they come across, whether it be in helping them to become more profitable, to be more productive, to place people in positions that are more in alignment with their preferred thinking and the kinds of work that require certain kinds of thinking. So that's the work that I do, and
Well,
it's a thrill.
Mike, thank you very much for being here. This is, we're about ready to
Thank
close.
you.
I want to thank you for the time that you spent. This is Mike Pelfini, and Mike is available for people who want more information, mike@michaelpelfini.com, and we'll have his information. He has a website and contact information for people who are interested in more about this. I'd like to thank Seroptimus International of Novato, our volunteer crew, for helping put this together. I'd like to thank specifically Leon Johnson, who serves as our studio engineer. Mike Pelfini, thank you very much for taking the time to be here.
Thanks, Madeline.
I'd also like to acknowledge the Buck Institute for Research on Aging, which generously makes the television studio available to us. My name is Madeline Peters. Our topic today has been whole brain thinking and its application in a variety of settings to build teams and communication to work effectively. Thank you very much.